The cold in the Great Lakes Exclusion Zone isn't a weather condition. It is a physical predator. It is a sentient, patient weight that sits upon the world, waiting for the laws of thermodynamics to claim their due. At minus 80 degrees Celsius, the very concept of life becomes an expensive anomaly in this world. Heat is the only currency that matters, and I am rapidly slipping into a deficit that I cannot afford. The air doesn't just bite here, it colonizes. It waits for the slightest microfracture in a suit seal, the thinnest patch of aerogel insulation, or the briefest moment of human fatigue to rush in and turn blood into jagged slush. I have spent 3 years studying this cold as a researcher, and yet every time the wind howls against the titanium-reinforced hulled lung, I feel like a trespasser in a universe that has decided to simplify itself back down to absolute zero. My home is a lung, a reinforced geodesic hydroponic dome buried deep beneath 20 feet of hard-packed, blue-tinted permafrost near the ruins of what was once Charlevoix, Michigan. For 3 years, I have lived here in a state of suspended animation, a self-appointed curator of the last green things on Earth. I tend to rows of genetically hardened kale, nitrogen-fixing soy, and a specific bioluminescent strain of Arctic moss under the flickering, violet glow of industrial UV lamps. My days are measured in nutrient ratios, pH balances, and the steady, reassuring hum of the geothermal tap. This tap is a titanium needle driven 600 feet into a volcanic fissure that cracked open during the flash, the day the atmosphere fractured and the cold leaked in from a void. That tap provides a constant, thrumming warmth, a low-frequency vibration that I've come to hear as a heartbeat of my own survival. It is the only thing that separates me from the deep freeze, a world where the air is so brittle it can shatter a human lung like a piece of thin glass if inhaled directly. When the tap is working, the lung is a humid, earthy sanctuary that smells of damp soil and life. When it fails, it becomes a countdown. The failure happened at 4:12. I didn't need the alarm to tell me. In the absolute silence of the exclusion zone, you become hyper-tuned to the noise of the machines. I felt the change in the vibration of the floorboards first, a subtle shift from a steady, deep register hum to a rhythmic, agonizing hitch. It was the sound of a heart skipping beats. Then came the sound of metal screaming, the sound of the geothermal pump, a rusted, 3-ton beast of machine, finally losing its battle with the abrasive, sulfurous minerals of the deep crust. It coughed a spray of metallic grit, hissed a final, dying breath of steam, and went silent. The silence that followed was terrifying. It was a vacuum that the cold immediately began to fill. I rolled out of my bunk, the floor already beginning to sap the warmth from my wool socks through the floor mats. I didn't turn on the lights. The emergency reds were already pulsing, casting long, bloody shadows across the rows of kale. My breath was already blooming in a thick, gray cloud that hung stationary in the air, refusing to dissipate. The internal thermometer on the wall was plummeting with a speed that made my stomach turn. 18 degrees Celsius, 15 degrees Celsius, 12 degrees Celsius. By the time I reached the engine room in the sublevel, the condensation on the copper pipes had already turned to jagged needles of frost. The air smelled of burnt oil and ozone. I grabbed a lead pipe and hammered on the regulator, a desperate, primitive gesture born of a man who had forgotten how to pray, but the machine remained cold. I shone my flashlight onto the primary exchange, and my heart sank. The manifold, a custom-cast alloy designed to withstand 500 degrees of thermal stress, had sheared clean through. The fracture was crystalline and perfect, a victim of metal fatigue and the relentless pressure of the Earth's shifting crust. If I didn't replace it, the lung would become a tomb within 6 hours. In 4 hours, the plants, the result of 3 years of painstaking genetic selection, would blacken and liquefy as their cell walls burst from the internal expansion of freezing water. In 5, The water lines would freeze and shatter the reinforced concrete of the foundations. By the 6th hour, the cold would seep through the aerogel insulation of my living quarters until my very blood began to crystallize in my veins. Delta Station, I whispered, the words feeling heavy and metallic in the freezing air. Delta was a research outpost 3 miles to the northeast, sitting directly on the frozen expanse of the lake. It had been abandoned during the first flash, when the government realized the Great Lakes weren't going to thaw and the evacuation ships were being crushed by the ice. But its storerooms were supposed to be stocked with modular parts for these specific geothermal units. 3 miles across the crust, the name we gave to the infinite, featureless plain of ice that was once Lake Michigan. 3 miles of exposure to a sky that wanted me dead. I began the ritual of the suit. In the silent winter, your suit is your god. It is your only advocate in a world that has denied your right to exist. It is a masterpiece of desperation, a multi-layered sarcophagus designed to trick the environment into thinking I don't exist. It starts with a base layer of heated wire mesh that sits directly against the skin, followed by a thick skin of aerogel insulation, the same material used to protect spacecraft during re-entry, that is capped with pressurized outer shell of white Kevlar and a helmet with a gold-filmed visor to reflect the blinding, ultraviolet glare of the ice. I checked the lithium-sulfur battery packs. They were at 80%. This was the most dangerous variable. In this cold, the lithium plates become sluggish and the power drains like water from a sieve as the suit fights to maintain a survivable internal temperature of 20 degrees Celsius against an external environment of minus 80 degrees Celsius. I had 4 hours of active heating before the suit became a refrigerator. I grabbed my pack, a heavy-duty ice axe, and a handful of magnesium flares. I didn't take a gun. Bullets don't fire well at 80 below. The gunpowder becomes unstable, and the grease in the chamber would freeze into glue after the first shot. My only defense was my speed, my tether, and my ability to stay conscious as the carbon dioxide scrubber struggled. I stepped into the airlock, the inner door sealed with a heavy, pressurized clack that echoed to the dying greenhouse like a funeral bell. I hit the cycle button. The outer door groaned, the hydraulic fluid complaining with a high-pitched whine as it fought the thickening cold. When it finally slid open, the world vanished. There was no sky, no horizon, and no sun, only the Whiteout. The Whiteout is a vertical sea of frozen mist and wind-driven ice crystals that scours the visor of my helmet like sandpaper. It is a world without depth perception, where up and down are mere suggestions. I stepped out, and my boots hit the ice with a sound like a gunshot. The crust was so cold it had the structural density of granite. It didn't crunch. It rang with metallic resonance that traveled up my leg bones and rattled my teeth. I tethered a high-tension nylon line to the airlock handle and began to walk. The wind was a physical weight, a wall of invisible lead pushing against my chest, trying to force me back into the safety of the dark. Every breath I took through the suit's recycler tasted of ozone, dry metal, and the recycled sweat of my own fear. I leaned into the gale, my body tilted at a 45-degree angle just to keep from being knocked flat by the gusts. 10 minutes into the trek, the sensors on my wrist began to chirp a warning I already knew. Ambient temp, minus 84 degrees Celsius. Wind chill, minus 102 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, physics starts to get weird. Plastics become as brittle as glass. The very oil in my suit's joints was beginning to thicken, making every movement a chore. I kept my head down, my world reduced to the flickering blue HUD of the compass on my visor. I was walking across a graveyard of ships, the Edmund Fitzgerald and 1,000 others, buried hundreds of feet beneath the ice I stood upon. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic thump hiss of my respirator and the occasional tectonic groan of the lake ice shifting under the immense pressure of the atmospheric freeze. These groans sounded like the planet itself was cracking open. But then the silence changed. It didn't break. It shifted. I felt it before I heard it. A vibration through the soles of my boots that didn't match the chaotic, buffeting frequency of the wind. It was a rhythmic, scraping sound. It sounded like a massive serrated blade being dragged slowly across a frozen sidewalk. Scree-tuck, scree-tuck. I stopped. I held my breath, listening to the frantic, irregular thudding of my own heart against the interior of the suit. The scraping stopped the exact moment I did. I turned my head slowly, the servos in the suit's neck joint whirring with an audible protest. From a white void 20 yards to my left came a low, wet huff, the sound of a massive lung, exhausting a massive volume of air into the sub-zero cold. It wasn't the sound of a machine. It was biological. It was deep, resonant, and carried a terrifying amount of moisture. Something was out here. Evolution hadn't stopped with a flash. It had simply moved into the basement. Something had adapted to the Whiteout. Something that didn't need a geothermal tap to stay warm, because its very chemistry had been rewritten by the frost. In the early days of the exclusion zone, the survivors spoke of the glass coats. We thought they were hallucinations brought on by hypoxia and the Whiteout madness. They said these creatures were the lake's way of reclaiming the surface, beasts made of ice and hunger. I didn't believe in them until I saw the tracks. 6-toed indentations in the ice that looked like they had been burned in with acid. I reached for a flare, my gloved fingers fumbling with the striker. My dexterity was failing. The cold was winning the battle against the suit's heating coils. I didn't want to see what was out there, but the uncertainty was a poison that would paralyze me. I needed to know if I was being hunted, or if I was just passing a ghost of the storm. I struck the flare. Brilliantly hot, violent red light flooded the white world, turning the ice into a sea of blood. For a split second, the glare pierced the mist, and I saw a silhouette that made my skin crawl beneath the aerogel. It was long, perhaps 12 feet, and sat low to the ice on 6 multi-jointed limbs that ended in hooked talons. It was covered in a thick, matted coat of translucent needles that looked like shards of glass or frozen fiber optics. They didn't just provide insulation, they seemed to catch and refract the light, making the creature almost invisible against the ice, like a living prism. It was a biological stealth suit. It didn't scream. It didn't roar. It just watched me with eyes that reflected the red flare like twin pools of frozen mercury. There was no hunger in those eyes, only a cold, predatory curiosity. It was assessing me. It was calculating my caloric value versus the effort required to break through my Kevlar shell. The flare flickered and died, the heat of the magnesium overwhelmed by the sheer, sucking mass of the cold. The world plunged back into the gray-white gloom, but the image remained burned into my retinas like a brand. I didn't run. Running in this suit would spike my heart rate, flood my visor with fog, and drain my batteries in minutes as the suit struggled to compensate for the exertion. I took a slow, measured step back toward the direction of Delta Station, my ice axe held tight in my human hand. My knuckles were white, though I couldn't see them. I had 2 miles of ice left to cross. My battery was at 60% and dropping faster than the charts predicted. I was being trailed by a predator that was perfectly camouflaged for a world of white. The wind was picking up, screaming now at a pitch that sounded like human voices in agony. And somewhere, 3 miles behind me, the last green things on planet, my kale, my soy, my hope, were beginning to freeze into black glass. I turned my back to the creature and began to walk again, but I didn't turn off my rear-facing sonar. I could feel the scraping start up again, exactly 10 paces behind me. It wasn't just following me, it was timing me. It was waiting for my battery to hit zero. It was waiting for the heat to go out, so it could eat a meal that was already pre-chilled. I had to reach Delta. I had to find that manifold. And I had to do it before the silent winter, claimed another specimen for its collection. The trek to Delta Station felt less like a walk and more like a slow-motion plunge into a lightless abyss. In the exclusion zone, distance is a deceptive metric. 3 miles on a map is a line you can cover with the tip of your thumb. 3 miles on a crust at minus 84 degrees is a marathon through a meat grinder. Every step requires a conscious effort of the will. Lift the boot, swing the leaden weight of the leg, plant the heel, and pray the ice doesn't fracture. The wind had shifted from a steady roar to a pulsing rhythmic beat, slamming into my left side with enough force to stagger a pack mule. My HUD flickered, the blue light stuttering as the extreme cold began to interfere with the liquid crystal display. Battery, 54%. Internal temp, 19.2 degrees Celsius. I could still hear the glass coat. It stopped the rhythmic scraping and replaced it with a soft, unervingly quiet click hiss. It was the sound of its crystalline needles brushing against each other, a sound like 1,000 glass wind chimes being shattered in a velvet bag. It stayed exactly at the edge of my peripheral vision, a blur of refracted light that moved whenever I did. It was playing a game of thermal attrition. It knew that every minute I spent out here, my suit was dying. It was waiting for the moment my heating coils gave out, the moment I became nothing more than a warm-blooded battery pack wrapped in a soft Kevlar shell. The terrain began to change. The flat, featureless ice of the shoreline gave way to the pressure ridges of the deep lake. These were massive, jagged upheavals where the ice had collided and buckled, forming frozen mountain ranges 10 or 15 feet high. I had to climb. I dug the pick of my ice axe into a wall of translucent blue ice and hauled myself upward. The effort was agonizing. My breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps, and the CO2 scrubbers of my pack were beginning to whine, struggling to keep up with my exertion. When I reached the top of the ridge, the Whiteout parted for a tantalizing second. There was Delta Station. It looked like a cluster of rusted, metallic mushrooms sprouting from the ice. 3 main domes, connected by pressurized glass-reinforced corridors, sat on hydraulic stilts designed to keep the structures above the shifting snow line. But the stilts were gone, buried under 30 feet of frozen lake. The station was now a sunken ruin, a ghost ship trapped in a sea of solid glass. One of the domes, the primary laboratory, had a jagged hole torn through its roof, as if a giant had reached down and peeled back the titanium plating like a sardine can. "Don't be empty," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Please don't be empty." I slid down the far side of the ridge, my boots throwing up a spray of ice crystals that sparkled like diamonds in my headlamps. As I approached the main airlock of Dome A, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The snow around the airlock hadn't been swept by the wind. It had been cleared. There were tracks, not the 6-legged, needle-sharp prints of a glass coat, but the distinct, heavy tread of a Mark IV thermal suit. My suit's predecessor. Someone was here, or someone had been here very recently. I reached the airlock door. It was a heavy, circular vault door, encrusted with a thick layer of rime ice. I cleared the keypad with my glove and tried the emergency override code. To my shock, the light on the panel didn't stay dead. It flickered a faint, dying amber. There was still a residual power draw in the station's core. The hydraulics groaned, a sound like a tectonic plate shifting, and the door lurched open 6 inches. It stopped there, jammed by a block of ice at the base. I threw my shoulder against it, my suit's servos whining at maximum torque. With a violent crack, the ice gave way, and I tumbled into the darkness of the transition chamber. I didn't wait for the cycle. I slammed the manual seal and leaned against the wall, my chest heaving. The silence inside the station was different than the silence of the ice. It was heavy, smelling of stale air, old grease, and something metallic, like dried blood. I checked my HUD. Battery, 42%. I had lost 12% of my power just in the walk. I couldn't afford to stay long. I clicked on my shoulder-mounted floodlights. The beams cut to the gloom of the airlock, revealing a hallway littered with debris. Frozen ration packs, shattered glass, and yellow papers were frozen into the floor like insects in amber. I moved toward the engineering bay, my boots clanging on the metal grating. "Hello?" I called out. The word echoed to the corridors, bouncing off the curved walls until it died in the distance. No one answered. I reached the door to the storage sector, the place where the manifolds were supposed to be. The door was ajar. As I stepped inside, the light from my shoulder lamp swept across the room. The shelves were mostly bare, picked clean by whoever had been here before me. My heart hammered against my ribs. If the manifold wasn't here, the lung was dead. I was dead. I began throwing crates aside, my movements frantic. Not here. Not here. Empty. Then I saw it. At the very back of the room, tucked behind a fallen ventilation duct, was a wooden crate stamped with a district office seal. I pried the lid off with my ice axe. Inside, nestled in a bed of shock-absorbing foam, was a brand-new, unpolished titanium manifold. It was beautiful, a complex knot of pipes and valves that represented another 3 years of life. I let out a sob of relief, a sound that was half laugh and half gasp. I reached for the part, but as my fingers closed around the cold metal, a shadow fell across the crate. I spun around, my ice axe raised. Standing in the doorway was a figure. It was wearing a suit, but the Kevlar was tattered and stained with a dark, oily substance. The visor was shattered, replaced by a piece of thick, industrial plastic held on with silver duct tape. Behind the plastic, I couldn't see a face, only the faint, sickly glow of a low-powered internal light. The figure didn't move. It held a heavy flare gun leveled at my chest. "You're late?" A voice crackled over the short-range radio. It was a woman's voice, but it sounded like it was being filtered through a throat full of gravel. "The district office stopped sending runners 2 years ago. Who the hell are you?" I lowered the axe an inch, my mind racing. "I'm from the lung. Dr. Aris Thorne. My pump failed. I need this part." The woman laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "The lung? That's still standing?" I thought the frost heave would have crushed that little glass marble a year ago. She stepped into the light. She wasn't alone. Behind her, 3 more figures emerged from the shadows of the engineering bay. They weren't wearing full suits. They were wearing scraps, bits of insulation and thermal plating bolted directly to heavy coats, their limbs wrapped in heating tape and wire. They looked like ghosts made of garbage. "We live here now," she said, gesturing to the ruins of Delta. "We're the leftovers, the ones the evacuation ships didn't have room for. And that manifold, that's the only thing keeping our backup heater running in the lower levels." "My greenhouse," I said, my voice rising in desperation. "It's the last of the food. If that dies, there's nothing left to restart the world with. I have kale, soy, seeds that haven't been frozen." "We can't eat seeds today, doctor," she said, her finger tightening on the trigger of the flare gun. "And we can't breathe if we freeze tonight. Leave the part. Turn around. Walk back into the white. Maybe the glass coats will be quick." I looked at the manifold, then at the 4 desperate, dying people in front of me. I knew what was in the lower levels of these stations. Nothing but damp concrete and the slow rot despair. But the lung was a miracle. It was a green spark in a white void. "There's a creature outside," I said, my voice steadying. "A glass coat. It's been trailing me for 2 miles. It's waiting by the airlock." The woman's posture changed. The word glass coat had a visible effect on the group. They glanced at each other, the fear in their eyes reflecting the red emergency lights of the station. "How close?" she asked. 10 paces behind me when I hit the door. I replied, "It's big. 12 feet, 6 legs." She cursed and lowered the flare gun. "If it's a 6-legger, the airlock won't hold it. They can vibrate their needles to crack the seals." They like the heat inside the domes even more than we do. Suddenly, a massive thrum shook the station. It wasn't the wind. It was a strike, a heavy, calculated blow against the outer hull of Dome A. Then came the sound. Scree-tuck, scree-tuck. The glass coat wasn't waiting anymore. It was tired of the cold, too. "Listen to me," I said, stepping forward. "The manifold in your heater is failing, but I bet it's not sheared yet. I can fix yours with the spare parts in my pack, and I'll take the new one back to the lung. But we have to move. If that thing gets in here, we're all just frozen meat." The woman looked at the door, then back at me. The station shuddered again, and the sound of metal groaning under extreme pressure filled the room. The glass coat was testing the structural integrity of the airlock. "Fine," she hissed, "but you work fast. If you try to run with that part, I'll put a magnesium slug through your visor." I didn't argue. I grabbed the manifold and stuffed it into my pack, the weight of it a reassuring anchor. We sprinted toward the stairs leading to the sublevels, the sound of the creatures scraping getting louder and more frantic behind us. As we descended into the dark, damp belly of Delta Station, I checked my HUD one last time. Battery, 38%. I was 3 miles from home, trapped in a dying station with a group of desperate scavengers, and the most efficient predator on the planet was currently peeling the front door off its hinges. The silent winter was no longer just outside. It was coming in. The sublevel of Delta Station was a humid, claustrophobic nightmare, a stark contrast to the dry, crystalline vacuum of the surface. Down here, the laws of the silent winter were momentarily suspended, replaced by the laws of a sinking ship. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of stagnant water, old ozone, and the sour, sharp tang of unwashed bodies. Rust-colored condensation dripped from the ceiling, sizzling with a violent hiss as it hit the heated mesh of my suit. The leftovers led me through a labyrinth of narrow corridors, their makeshift gear, bits of scavenged insulation and wire, clattering against the corrugated metal walls like the bones of a skeleton. The woman, Sarah, kept a flare gun trained on the back of my helmet. She didn't trust me, and in this world, trust was a luxury that had frozen to death decades ago. A stranger wasn't a guest. A stranger was a competitor for the last few calories of warmth left on the planet. "In here," Sarah barked, shoving a heavy steel door aside. The hinges screamed, a high-pitched metal-on-metal wail that seemed to vibrate directly into my marrow. The engine room of Delta was a relic of a forgotten era of engineering, a cathedral of rust and failing steam. The central heater was a massive, cylindrical vat of boiling glycol, pulsing with a sick, irregular rhythm that made the entire deck plate beneath my boots thrum. The manifold attached to it was a disaster, a mess of carbon scoring, deep-seated corrosion, and leaking steam that whistled a high, piercing note. That whistle was the sound of the station's death rattle. It indicated that the internal pressure was reaching critical, explosive levels. This wasn't just a heater anymore. It was a pressurized bomb. If the unit blew, the entire sublevel would be flooded with superheated liquid, followed by a flash freeze that would turn this room into a block of solid ice in less than 10 minutes. "The seal is completely blown," I said, my voice muffled and echoing inside my respirator. "I can't just swap the manifold while the system is under this much load. I have to vent the glycol, reset the pressure valves, and hope the primary core doesn't go into meltdown while the loop is open." "We don't have time for a textbook repair, Doctor," one of the men shouted, his voice cracking with raw, jagged terror. "Listen to the ceiling. It's already through the first layer." From the deck above us, a sound tore through the station that made the hair on my neck stand up. It wasn't the rhythmic scraping of the ice anymore. It was the sound of a high-speed industrial saw cutting through bone. The glass coat had found a weak point in the airlock's primary gasket. It was vibrating its translucent, needle-like coat at a frequency that turned reinforced titanium into brittle powder. This was the creature's true evolutionary edge. It wasn't just a hunter of flesh. It was a hunter of structures. It was a living resonance weapon, capable of shattering the very barriers humans built to keep the world out. "Do it now," Sarah hissed, her eyes wide and bloodshot behind her duct-tape plastic visor. "Or I'll vent your suit and use your internal heater to keep this core warm for another hour. Your choice." I knelt before the machine, my gloved fingers trembling as I reached into my pack. The heat in the room was actually triggering my suit's internal cooling system, a bizarre, dizzying sensation after nearly freezing to death on the lake. My HUD flickered, the blue light stuttering as the logic gates struggled with the rapid temperature shift. Battery, 32%. Internal temp, 22.1 degrees Celsius. The suit was working overtime, and the lithium-sulfur core was bleeding power at an unsustainable rate. I began to work on the manifold bolts. They were fused with decades of salt air and volcanic mineral deposits. I had to use my ice axe as a pry bar, leaning my entire body weight into the tool, praying titanium wouldn't snap and leave me helpless. Above us, the ceiling groaned, a deep metallic moan of surrendering steel. A section of the ventilation ductwork collapsed, sending a shower of frozen soot and ancient dust onto the deck. The glass coat was in the upper dome. I could hear its weight now, a heavy, multi-limb thud-thud-thud as it navigated the laboratory benches, likely smelling the infrared heat signature pouring off our bodies. "It's tracking the heat," I muttered, the sweat stinging my eyes inside my helmet. "It's not just looking for a meal, it's looking for the source." "Then hurry the hell up," Sarah yelled, glancing nervously at the crumbling ceiling. I yanked on the wrench with everything I had. The first bolt gave way with a screech that sounded like a gunshot. Then the second. On the third bolt, the manifold finally cracked. A jet of scalding, pressurized glycol sprayed out, hitting the left shoulder of my suit with the force of fire hose. The HUD screamed a catastrophic warning. External temp, 122 degrees Celsius. Hull integrity, 88%. The Kevlar and aerogel held, but the thermal transfer was instantaneous. I felt the skin on my shoulder blister and peel beneath the suit's lining. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. If I let go now, the pressure would rip the rest of the manifold off and scald everyone in the room to death. I slammed the new manifold into place, the one I had planned to take back to the lung. It was a moment of profound betrayal. This piece of machinery was supposed to be the salvation of my green world, the protector of the last seeds of the old earth. Now, it was being sacrificed to save a group of scavengers in a dying station. I tightened the bolts with a frantic, rhythmic intensity, my vision blurring. "Done," I yelled, throwing the wrench aside. "Flip the bypass. Now!" Sarah lunged to the control panel, slamming her fist against the red manual override. The machine coughed, a violent, bone-shaking shudder rippling to the floorboards, and then it settled into a deep, healthy roar. The piercing whistle died away. The pressure gauges began to climb back into the safe, green zone. For a heartbeat, there was silence. We all stood there, breathing the recycled metallic air, the red emergency lights reflecting off our visors like the eyes of ghosts. Then, the ceiling exploded. The glass coat didn't fall through the breach. It shredded through it. The creature came through the metal, like a predator through dry tall grass. It was even more terrifying in the flickering red light of the sublevel. Its 6 limbs were hooked directly into the structural support beams, and its needle coat was vibrating so fast it looked like a shimmering blur of digital static. The red light caught the liquid mercury in its eyes, making them glow an unholy, intelligent fire. It didn't attack the scavengers. It ignored the man screaming in the corner and the woman with the flare gun. It turned its long, triangular head toward me. Specifically, it turned toward the power pack on my back. It wants the battery. I realized, the horror cold and sharp in my gut. It's not hunting for meat. It's an energy parasite. It wants the lithium-sulfur core. The creature lunged. It moved with a liquid grace that defied the laws of the cold, its body rippling like a wave of broken glass. Sarah fired the flare gun. The magnesium slug hit the creature in the shoulder, erupting in a fountain of white-hot sparks that illuminated every terrifying detail of its translucent anatomy. The glass coat shrieked, a sound like 1,000 violins being snapped simultaneously, and recoiled, its needles rattling in a frenzied, angry cadence. Run! To the subdock! Sarah screamed, grabbing me by the arm and hauling me toward the exit. The old maintenance tunnel leads to the shoreline. We scrambled out of the engine room, sprinting down a hallway that was rapidly filling with freezing air as the breach above us sucked the warmth out of sublevel. The station was dying, the pressure equalizing with the frozen void outside. I could hear the glass coat behind us, recovering from the flare, its claws tearing through the metal deck plates as it gave chase. It was faster than us. It was built for this. We reached the subdock, a concrete bunker that housed the station's old emergency vehicles. Most were stripped of the frames, skeletal remains of a failed civilization. But in the center, there was a single rusted snowcat sitting on its heavy rubber tracks. "Get in! Get in!" Sarah commanded, diving into the driver's seat and tearing at the ignition cables. I scrambled into the back, the manifold heavy pack thumping against the floorboards as the two other scavengers piled in beside me. The engine turned over with a pathetic, wheezing sound. The glass coat appeared at the entrance of the dock, its body shimmering as it adjusted its refraction to match the dark concrete. It was almost invisible now, a ripple in the air that smelled like ozone and old ice. "Come on, you piece of junk." Sarah screamed, slamming the starter. The engine caught with a roar. A cloud of thick black diesel smoke filled the cabin, and for a second, the glass coat hesitated, confused by the sudden heat and the opacity of the smoke. Sarah slammed it into gear, and the snowcat lurched forward, crashing to the rusted dock doors and out into the blinding, white abyss of the lake. The transition from the 40-degree engine room to the minus 85 degrees Celsius of the surface was like being hit by a freight train. The windows of the snowcat instantly frosted over with a thick layer of rime. Sarah didn't slow down. She drove by instinct in the faint, flickering glow of the navigational HUD. "We made it!" One of the men gasped, his chest heaving as he leaned back against the frozen metal wall of the cabin. "We actually got out." I looked out the small, reinforced porthole in the rear door, scraping away a patch of frost with my glove. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to break the fragile bubble of their hope. But in the red, rhythmic glow of our taillights, I saw a ripple in the blowing snow. The glass coat wasn't just following us. It was keeping pace, running alongside the vehicle with a tireless, predatory gait that suggested it hadn't even reached its full speed. I checked my HUD. Battery, 26%. The suit was failing. The heaters were struggling to keep up with the wind chill being forced into the cabin seams. I looked at the old, broken manifold I had retrieved from the lung. It was worthless. I had used the only good part to save the people in this cabin, and in doing so, I had likely signed a death warrant for the last greenhouse on Earth. I had 3 miles to go, a predator on my roof, and no way to fix the world I had left behind. Sarah glanced at me in the rearview mirror, her eyes hard. "The lung," she said quietly over the radio. "You said you had seeds. You said you had a world that was still green." "I did," I said, my voice hollow. "But I gave the heart of it to your heater. Sarah was silent for a long time, the snowcat bouncing over a pressure ridge that sent us all into ceiling. When we slammed back down, she spoke again. Then we don't stop at the lung. We go through it. We take everything that's left and we move further south. There's a rumor of a geothermal vent in the ruins of Lansing. If your seeds are real, they're the only currency we have left to buy our way in. If we make it that far, I said, looking up at the ceiling, the sound of the glasscoat's claws digging into the roof was a steady, rhythmic tapping. It was the sound of a predator that knew exactly how much time was left on the clock. I checked the charge one more time. 24%. The silent winter was closing in, and the green world was fading into the white. The snowcat was a dying beast, a mechanical carcass being held together by nothing but Sarah's iron will and the desperate prayers of the men huddled in the back. We were pushing the vintage diesel block into a red-line frenzy that shouldn't have been possible in this temperature. At minus 88 degrees, metal becomes as brittle as porcelain, and the oil in the engine block turns into a thick, tar-like sludge that fights every revolution of the pistons. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was a violent tug-of-war. The heater was blowing a frantic, dry warmth that barely managed to keep our breath from freezing into solid masks, while the wind chill outside, a staggering negative 110 with the vehicle's velocity, was a ghost that seeped through every rusted seam and bolt hole. Sarah drove like a woman possessed by a vengeful spirit. Her hands, wrapped in layers of duct tape and greasy wool, were white-knuckled on the wheel. She didn't look at the frosted-over windows. She couldn't see through them anyway. She stared at the navigational HUD, which was now little more than a smear of ghostly blue light flickering against the dashboard. The 3 miles back to the lung felt like a traverse across an alien planet, a journey through a white void where time and distance had lost all meaning. Every jolt of the treads over a pressure ridge sent a shock wave through my spine, a reminder that we were balanced on a razor's edge between survival and a very quiet, very permanent end. "We're losing torque," one of the men shouted, his voice nearly drowned out by the metallic rattling of the cabin. "The left track is slipping. The ice is too smooth here, Sarah." "I don't care if the treads melt." Sarah screamed back, her voice cracking with the strain. "Keep your heads down and hold on to something. If we stop now, the cold will have us in 90 seconds. She slammed the gear lever into a low-range crawl, and the snowcat lurched upward, its heavy rubber treads biting into a massive pressure ridge that formed like a jagged granite wall since I'd left. The engine emitted a high-pitched, agonizing whine. I looked up at the ceiling, my heart hammering. The scraping had stopped. The tapping had stopped. For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought the glass coat had been thrown off by the vehicle's violent motion when we hit the ridge. But then, the roof of the cabin began to bow inward. A long, serrated indentation appeared in the reinforced steel, the metal groaning as it was pinched and twisted. Then came the sound, a high-frequency vibration that rattled my very teeth. The creature wasn't just riding us. It was attempting to deconstruct the vehicle while we were still inside it. It was using that terrifying resonance to find the structural fatigue points in the steel, turning our only shield into a pile of scrap. The gold film on my visor blurred as the vibration traveled through my suit, a sickening low-frequency hum that felt like it was trying to shake my organs loose. "It's coming through the roof," I yelled, reaching for my ice axe with fingers that felt like lead. "We're almost there. Look at the horizon." Sarah cried, pointing through a small patch of cleared frost on the windshield. Through the chaotic swirl of the Whiteout, a shape began to resolve. It wasn't the glowing, emerald beacon of hope I had visualized during the long walk. The lung, which usually sat beneath the snow like a warm, pulsing heart visible to thermal sensors for miles, was dark. The exterior floodlights were dead. The perimeter sensors, which usually ping my suit with a welcoming handshake, were silent. But worse than the darkness was the silhouette. The geodesic dome wasn't a perfect sphere anymore. Several of the reinforced glass polymer panels had been shattered, and a thick, jagged crust of blue rime ice was growing over the breach like a scab on a wound. My heart plummeted into my stomach. If the shell was breached, the internal atmosphere, the humid, life-giving air I had cultivated for 3 years, would have equalized with the surface in a matter of minutes. My plants, my kale, my soy, the last green oxygen producers in the zone, will be nothing more than brittle, black sticks of frozen carbon. Sarah slammed the snowcat into a massive drift 20 yards from the lung's primary airlock. The vehicle groaned, the engine giving one final, metallic gasp of black smoke before stalling out. The silence that followed was absolute and heavy, broken only by the mournful whistling of the wind against the cabin walls. Out! Out now! Move or freeze. Sarah commanded, kicking the side door open. We scrambled out of the rear, stepping into a world that had somehow grown even more hostile. My HUD chirped a final, mournful warning in a tinny, digital voice, ambient temp, minus 91 degrees Celsius. Battery, 16%. Warning, thermal mesh degradation. At this level, the suit's life support systems were beginning to cannibalize themselves, prioritizing the core temperature of my torso over my extremities. My hands and feet felt like blocks of wood, the heating mesh of my sleeves pulsing with a weak, dying warmth. As we stumbled toward the airlock, I looked up and saw the nightmare made manifest. The glass coat was perched on top of the stalled snowcat, its translucent body glowing with a faint, rhythmic bioluminescent pulse that shifted from pale blue to a sickly violet. It wasn't attacking. It didn't need to. It was watching us with those mercury pool eyes, calculating. And then I realized why it was so patient. From the shadows of the breached dome, more of them emerged. They were everywhere. 4, 5, maybe 6 of the creatures were clinging to the exterior of the lung like parasitic insects. They moved with synchronized, eerie grace, their glass needle coats catching the faint, ambient light and scattering it into 1,000 tiny, mocking rainbows. They hadn't just been attracted to the heat of the greenhouse. When the pump failed, they had sensed the dying warmth and accelerated the destruction. They were feeding on the residual thermal energy of the building, vibrating the glass panels until they shattered so they could get to the richer heat stored in the soil and the water tanks. They're harvesting the station. I whispered, the horror of it paralyzing my lungs. They're eating the warmth. Get to the door, Thorne. Don't look at them. Sarah shoved me toward the airlock with a force that nearly sent me sprawling into the snow. We reached the outer hatch. I didn't need a code this time. The door was slightly ajar, the massive hydraulic arm bent at a grotesque angle, as if something had tried to pry it open from the inside. We squeezed through the gap and slammed the manual override bar, the heavy steel dropping into brackets with a hollow, final thud. We were inside the transition chamber, but there was no hiss of oxygen, no roar of the heaters. The air was dead flat and carried the smell of the end of the world. I led the way into the main dome, my shoulder-mounted floodlights cutting through the gloom. I took 3 steps and felt my knees, the Kevlar of my suit clattering against the frozen floorboards. The greenhouse was a graveyard of dreams. The rows of kale, would have been a vibrant, defiant green only hours ago, were now crystalline and gray, slumped over their hydroponic trays like mourners. The soy plants had collapsed into piles of frozen mulch. The moisture in the air, the humidity that I had fought so hard to maintain, had turned into a thick, suffocating layer of rime ice that covered every surface, turning my sanctuary into a cathedral of frost. Every leaf was an ornament of ice. Every stem was a brittle spear. No! I breathed, my voice a broken rasp in the comms. No, no, no. I reached out a gloved hand, my fingers brushing against a frozen kale leaf. It didn't bend. It shattered at my touch, the pieces tinkling like broken glass on the floor. I had failed. The green world was gone, replaced by the same monochromatic white that ruled the rest of the planet. The scavengers stood behind me, their light sweeping across the destruction in silence. They didn't offer platitudes. They knew what this meant as well as I did. This wasn't just my loss. It was a loss of the only reason they had for crossing the ice. The seeds were a fairy tale, and the fairy tale had just frozen to death. "The seeds," Sarah said, her voice unusually soft, almost a whisper. "Thorne, look at me. You said there were seeds. You said there was a vault." I stood up, my legs shaking with a combination of cold and grief. The vault, the sub-basement. It's a lead-line seed bank built into the bedrock. It has its own independent thermal backup, a chemical salt battery, but it only lasts for 12 hours without a primary draw from the geothermal tap. If the tap is dead, if the station is this cold. I checked my HUD. Battery, 12%. My vision was beginning to tunnel, the edges of the display darkening as the suit's processor throttled down to save power. I had maybe 20 minutes before the life support cut out entirely and the silent winter moved inside my suit. We moved toward the sub-basement stairs, our boots crunching through the frozen remains of my harvest. But as we reached the landing, a sound echoed from below that stopped us all in our tracks. It wasn't the scraping of a glass coat. It was a human sound, a wet, racking, agonizing cough. I hurried down the stairs, my light reflecting off the ice-coated walls. At the bottom, huddled against the heavy, circular vault door of the seed bank, was a figure. It was an old man, wrapped in layers of silver thermal blankets and tattered wool, his face pale and waxy in the glare of my light. "Miller?" I gasped. He looked up, his eyes glassy and unfocused, his skin blue-tinged from the onset of severe hypothermia. Miller was a technician who had been stationed at the lung before I arrived, a man who was supposed to have died in the first flash when he went out to check the perimeter and never came back. He had been a ghost in my stories for 3 years. "Aris," he wheezed, a thin line of frozen blood on his lip. "You're back. You brought the manifold from Delta?" "Miller, what happened? How are you still alive?" "I couldn't leave them," he coughed, gesturing toward the vault. "The seeds, they're the only thing that matters, Aris. I lived in the service vents, stayed in the crawl spaces. I kept the small chemical heater going as long as I could. But the glass things, they smelled the warmth. They broke the dome, Aris. They let the winter in to get to me." He reached out a shaking, frostbitten hand, clutching a small, black industrial box. The manifold, I tried to swap it. I found the backup in the old storage locker, but I'm too old. My hands, they don't work in the cold anymore. I couldn't get the bolts to turn. I looked at the box. It was an unblemished titanium manifold. The original spare that Miller must have hidden away years ago, a secret he'd kept even from the district office records. I need the one from Delta. I had been carrying the solution in my own home the entire time I was out there fighting for my life. "Sarah, give me the toolkit. Now!" I commanded, my voice regaining its edge. "The monsters are coming through the breach, Thorne," she shouted, pointing her light toward the ceiling. One of the glass coats was crawling to the shattered panels above, its needle coat vibrating with a terrifying, rhythmic intensity as it prepared to drop into the sub-basement. "Hold them off," I yelled, dropping to my knees beside the auxiliary pump. "I need 5 minutes. If I can get the vault's primary heater back online, the infrared radiation will drive them out. They're built for the cold. They can't stand a concentrated thermal spike." Sarah stepped forward, her tattered suit looking like a knight's armor in the red emergency light. She leveled the flare gun. The 2 men with their pulled-out lengths of sharpened rebar and heavy wrenches. They were terrified starving and freezing, but they were cornered in the last warm place on Earth. I knelt by the vault's pump, my fingers moving with a speed born of pure, distilled adrenaline. I ignored the HUD warnings that were now screaming in my ears. I ignored the freezing air that was clawing at my throat with every breath. I focused only on the bolts, the gaskets, and the beautiful, cold titanium of the manifold. Behind me, the first flare erupted in a blinding, crimson flash. The glass coat shrieked, a sound of pure, crystalline agony that shook the very foundations of the dome. Then came the sound of metal hitting glass, the desperate grunts of men fighting for a future they couldn't even see. "Come on," I hissed, slamming the manifold into place and twisting the primary valve. "Work, damn you! Work for the green." I flipped the toggle. The pump coughed, a dry metallic sound. It sputtered once, twice, and then with a deep, glorious, bone-shaking thrum, the vault's heater roared to life. A wave of heat, real, honest-to-God, 100-degree heat, radiated out from the unit. The ice on the floor began to melt instantly, turning into a thick, swirling mist of steam. The glass coat at the top of the stairs recoiled, its needles rattling in distress as the infrared waves hit its sensitive hide. It shrieked once more and vanished back into the Whiteout, followed by its kin. They couldn't handle the fire, but I wasn't looking at the creatures. I was looking at my HUD. Battery, for percent. Warning, total system failure imminent. I slumped against the vault door, the heat of the pump feeling like a cruel joke. My suit was shutting down. The internal heaters died, and the cold of the dome began to seep in through the Kevlar. I had saved the seeds. I had saved the people. But I was out of time. Sarah turned to me, her face flushed from the heat. She saw me leaning there, my visor fogging over as the internal fan stopped. "Thorne!" she screamed, lunging for me. I closed my eyes, the world fading into a soft, quiet white. The last thing I heard was a heavy thud of the vault door finally creaking open and the faint, sweet, unmistakable smell of dry earth and dormant, living things. Darkness didn't come all at once. It arrived in stuttering, pixelated stages, as my suit's computer performed its final act of digital triage. First, the HUD vanished, taking the compass and the battery telemetry with it. Then, the internal heaters gave a final, pathetic throb against my chest before falling silent. Finally, the oxygen scrubbers were down into a low, mournful moan. I was encased in a 300-pound coffin of Kevlar and aerogel, listening to the sound of my own shallow breathing echoing in the plastic bowl of my helmet. Then, the world was ripped open. The seal of my helmet hissed as someone engaged the emergency release. The visor swung wide, and for the first time in 3 years, I smelled the air of the lung without a filter. It wasn't the freezing, sterile vacuum I expected. It was thick, heavy, and searingly hot. "Breathe, damn you, breathe." Sarah's voice wasn't coming through a radio anymore. It was raw, vibrating through the air, accompanied by the frantic thrumming of the vault's heater. I inhaled, and the heat hit my lungs like a physical blow. It was the scent of the vault, the smell of ancient dust, dry husks, and the metallic tang of the chemical salt batteries. I opened my eyes to see Sarah leaning over me. She had stripped off her tattered outer shell. Her face was streaked with soot and sweat, her eyes wide with manic, desperate sort of triumph. Behind her, the two scavengers were dragging Miller into the mouth of the vault. The heater it's holding, I managed to rasp. My voice sounded like dry parchment tearing. "It's doing more than holding," Sarah said, helping me sit up. "It's turned this basement into an oven. Those glass freaks won't come within 50 yards of stairs. But the dome is gone, Thorne. The upper levels are equalizing with the surface. We have the vault, and we have whatever we can pull into it before the upper structure collapses under the ice weight." I looked past her into the sanctum. The seed bank was a cathedral of shelves, filled with thousands of vacuum-sealed canisters. This was a global crop diversity project, a backup of a backup, buried here because the bedrock was supposed to be the most stable in the hemisphere. It wasn't just kale and soy. There were grains, fruits, hardwoods, the DNA of a world that had been dead for a generation. But we weren't alone in the vault. As my vision cleared, I saw them. In the corners of the vault, sitting on crates of wheat and corn, were 3 other figures. They were dressed in the same silver-threaded rags Miller had worn. They were the keepers, the original staff of the lung who had gone underground when the first frost eve shattered the surface sensors. They looked like ghosts, their skin translucent from years of living in the amber glow of emergency lights. "We thought you were a scavenger," one of them said, a woman with white hair cropped close to her skull. She held a heavy soldering iron like a weapon until we heard the pump kick over. Only a district tech knows the sequence for a 900 series manifold. "I'm Aris Thorne," I said, leaning against the cold lead lining of the vault wall. "I've been tending your garden for 3 years. I'm sorry, I couldn't save the surface crops." The woman looked at the open vault door, then back at me. "The surface crops were a decoy, Dr. Thorne, a way to keep the district office sending supplies. The real work, the hardening of the seeds, happened down here." Miller stayed topside to watch for the thaw. He was our lookout. Miller, lying on a pile of thermal blankets, gave a weak, watery smile. "I told you, Aris, I couldn't leave them." The reality of the situation began to settle in. We were 20 feet underground, trapped in a lead-lined box with enough seeds to replant a continent, but no way to reach the soil. Above us, the glass coats were likely circling the ruins of the dome, waiting for the heat of the vault to eventually bleed out. "We can't stay here forever," I said, looking at the thermal gauges on the vault wall. "The chemical salt batteries are being drained by the primary heater. At this rate, we have 72 hours of summer left. After that, the vault becomes the freezer. Then we have 72 hours to turn this snowcat into a mobile greenhouse," Sarah said, stepping forward. She looked at the keepers, then at her own men. "We have the manifold, we have the seeds, and we have a vehicle with a pressurized cabin. If we can vent the engine's exhaust through a heat exchanger, we can keep those canisters viable until we hit the Lansing vents." "Lansing is 400 miles, the white-haired woman said. "In a whiteout with glass coats." "We don't have a choice," Sarah replied. "The lung is dead. This vault is just a slower way to die. We take the seed, we take the tech, and we move south. We become the migration." I looked at the canisters. I thought of the kale shattering under my touch, the loss of the life I had known. But then I looked at the people in the room. Scavengers, scientists, and ghosts all gathered around a humming heater in the belly of the world. "The snowcat needs more than just a heater," I said, my mind shifting back into the cold, hard logic of survival. "It needs armor. The glass coats use resonance to shatter metal. If we wrap the hull in the lead lining from these walls, it'll dampen the vibration. We won't be fast, but we'll be solid." For the next 48 hours, the vault became a frantic factory. We worked in shifts fueled by the last of the lung's emergency rations, concentrated protein paste that tasted like chalk and salt. Sarah and her men handled the heavy labor, stripping the lead sheeting from the non-essential walls of the vault and bolting it to the exterior of the snowcat. The keepers and I worked on the Ark, a reinforced climate-controlled container that would house the most critical seed samples. We were cannibalizing our tomb to build our lifeboat. Every hour, the sound from above grew more ominous. The glass coats were no longer just watching. They were frustrated. We could hear them scraping at the concrete cap of the sub-basement, their vibrations causing dust to shake from the ceiling. They knew the heat was concentrated down here, and they were trying to find a seam. Battery at 20%, the white-haired keeper announced on the third morning. The lights are going to start flickering soon. The cat is ready, Sarah said, wiping grease from her forehead. She looked at me. Thorne, you're the only one who knows the navigation for the southern grid. You're in the hot seat. I looked at my old suit. It was hooked up to the vault's power supply, slowly trickling back to life. It was tattered, scarred by glycol burns and ice scratches, but it was the only thing that would get me from the vault door to the vehicle. Miller? I asked, looking at the old man. He shook his head. I'm staying, Aris. I'm part of the foundations now. I'll keep the heater running until the last of you are clear. Someone has to shut the door from the inside, so those things don't get the scent of the trail. Miller, you'll freeze, I said. I've been freezing for 30 years, son, he said, his voice surprisingly strong. I'd rather go out with a warm back and a full heart. Now get those seeds moving. The wind is dropping. It's the only window you'll get. We loaded the ark into back of the lead-shielded snowcat. The 6 of us squeezed into the cabin. The 3 scavengers, 2 keepers, and myself. The air was tight, smelling of sweat and desperation. Sarah hit the ignition. The engine roared, the sound muffled and heavy behind the new lead plating. Open the doors, she commanded. The vault's outer ramp groaned as it lowered into the snow. The transition was violent. The heat of the vault rushed out, meeting the minus 90 degrees Celsius air in a massive, swirling explosion of steam. For a second, we were blind, encased in a white fog of our own making. Go! I yelled. The snowcat lurched forward, its tracks grinding against the frozen concrete. As we cleared the ramp, I looked back through the rear porthole. I saw Miller standing in the golden light of the vault, his hand on the lever. He gave a sharp, final nod and pulled it. The heavy steel door slammed shut, sealing the heat inside. Then the shadows moved. The glass coats didn't go for the vault. They turned toward us. The red taillights of the snowcat reflected off their needle coats, turned them into a pack of shimmering, crimson demons. One of them leapt, its claws screeching against the lead shielding. It vibrated, but the sound was dull, absorbed by the heavy metal. The resonance failed. It works. Sarah laughed, a wild, jagged sound. The lead works. She slammed the vehicle into high gear. We plowed through the ruins of my greenhouse, crushing the frozen kale and the shattered glass under our treads. We broke through the perimeter fence and out onto the open ice of the lake. Behind us, the lung was a dark, broken tooth on the horizon. Ahead of us was 400 miles of the most hostile terrain on Earth. I checked my HUD. Battery, 98%. Internal temp, 20 degrees Celsius. I wasn't a lookout anymore. I was a gardener on the move. And for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't just surviving. I was traveling. The trek south was not a journey. It was a war of attrition conducted in a monochromatic void where the maps were useless and the compass was a liar. For 12 days, the lead-shielded snowcat became our entire universe. A rattling, claustrophobic metal box that smelled of recirculated breath, diesel fumes, and the sharp, metallic tang of the seed canisters. We moved through a world that had been scrubbed of all color and mercy, a landscape where the very concept of horizon had been erased by the Whiteout. The Great Lakes were a week behind us, replaced by the rolling, frozen hills of the Michigan interior. Here, the wind didn't just howl. It screamed to the skeletal remains of dead forests, the trees standing like blackened needles against a sky the color of a bruised lung. Every mile was a victory. Every hour the engine didn't seize was a miracle. Sarah drove in 4-hour shifts, her eyes bloodshot and fixed on the thermal imaging screen, because the windows had long since become opaque blocks of ice. The ark, the pressurized container holding the seeds, sat in the center of the cabin like an altar. We took turns sleeping against it, drawing comfort from the faint, electrical hum of its climate control system. It was the only thing in the world that was still warm, still pulsing with the potential of a spring that felt 1,000 years away. Movement at 2 o'clock. The white-haired keeper, Elena, whispered. Her voice was thin, cracked by the dry, recycled air of the cabin. She had been staring at the sonar array for hours, her fingers hovering over the gain dial. 3 signatures. Large. They aren't losing ground, Aris. If anything, they're closing the gap. I leaned over the console, looking at the graininess of the external sensors. The glass coats hadn't abandoned the chase. They were the apex predators of the silent winter, and they didn't understand the concept of giving up. They trailed us in a loose, shifting pack, their translucent bodies blurring against the blowing snow like ghosts in a blizzard. They were waiting for the snowcat to falter. They were waiting for a mechanical failure, a fuel leak, or a lapse in our vigilance. They were patient in a way that only a creature made of ice can be, surviving on the scraps of kinetic energy they could leach from the environment. They know we're nearing the vents, I said, my voice sounding hollow in a cramped cabin. The ambient temperature is rising. Look at the telemetry on the outer hull. Ambient temp, minus 62 degrees Celsius. To anyone else, it was still a death sentence. To us, it felt like a tropical heat wave. We were approaching the Lansing thermal rift, a deep earth fracture where the volcanic activity of the flash had stayed active, creating a pocket of rising heat that kept the snow from packing into granite hard ice. It was a place of steam, sulfur, and mud, a biological anomaly in a frozen world. The rift was a wound in the earth that bled heat, and for us, it was the only sanctuary left on the map. If we can hit the rift, the glass coats won't follow, Elena said, her fingers tracing the jagged line of the thermal map on the screen. The moisture in the air will frost their needles instantly. It'll throw off their resonance frequency. They'll be blind, heavy, and unable to vibrate their limbs. They'll be trapped in their own skin, unable to hunt. It's a death trap for a creature made of dry ice. We have to get there first, Sarah grunted, slamming the gear lever as the tread struggled with a patch of soft, volcanic ash mixed with thawing snow. The snowcat groaned, the lead shielding rattling violently against the chassis. The weight of the lead was immense, and the engine was beginning to overheat, a cruel irony in a world of sub-zero temperatures. The mud is getting thicker. If we bog down here, we're just a buffet in a lead box. The final mile was a gauntlet of steam and shadow. The terrain began to slope downward into a massive, jagged caldera. Huge plumes of sulfur steam rose from the ground like ghostly pillars, obscuring everything in a thick, gray fog that the thermal cameras couldn't pierce. The snowcat's engine began to choke on the thick, moisture-laden air, the oxygen sensors struggling to adjust to the sulfur content. The lead shielding, which had protected us from the creature's vibrations for hundreds of miles, was now a liability, making the vehicle sluggish and heavy in the softening, treacherous ground. Suddenly, the roof of the snowcat buckled with a deafening, metallic bang that sounded like a tectonic plate snapping. The alpha glass coat, the 12-foot monster that had stalked me from the ruins of Lung, had leapt from a frozen ridge directly onto our spine. This time, it wasn't just vibrating. It was using its sheer, crystalline mass to crush the cabin like an aluminum can. The lead plates groaned, the rivets popping like champagne corks and whistling through the cabin. One of the men screamed as a rivet tore through his shoulder, but there was no time for first aid. The Ark! I screamed, lunging to shield the seed container with my own body as a jagged shard of metal tore through the ceiling, missing my helmet by mere inches. Sarah, the hull is giving way. It's going to peel us open. I can't shake him. The mud is too deep to build any speed. Sarah yelled, fighting the wheel as the vehicle began to slide sideways down the steep, steaming slope. The snowcat was tilting, the center of gravity dangerously high, due to the weight of the creature on our roof. The creatures had appeared at the shattered rear porthole, its mercury eyes fixed on the heat radiating from the Arkansas. It let out a shriek, a high-frequency blast of pure resonance that shattered the remaining glass in the cabin into fine, crystalline powder. The cold of the upper rim rushed in, meeting the humid steam of the rift, and for a second, the cabin was filled with blinding, impenetrable white fog of condensation. We were blind, we were dying, and the beast was at the door. I knew what I had to do. I looked at my HUD, which was flickering with emergency power. Battery, 15%. It was enough for one final act of defiance. I grabbed my ice axe and the last magnesium flare from my belt. I looked at Sarah, her face illuminated by the sparking wires of the dashboard. Sarah stopped the cat. What? If I stop, we'll slide into the vent. Stop the cat and open the rear door. I'm going to give him what he's been hunting since Charlevoix. Sarah didn't argue. She trusted the desperation in my voice. She slammed the brakes, and the snowcat skidded to a halt at the very edge of a steaming fissure that hissed with the sound of 1,000 snakes. I kicked the rear door open and stepped out into the chaotic mix of freezing wind and scalding steam. The glass coat was already there, dropping from the roof to the mud with a heavy, wet thud. It towered over me, its needle coat frosted and heavy with condensation, just as Elena had predicted. It was slower here, its movements sluggish and uncoordinated as its internal cooling systems struggled with the ambient heat. But it was still a 12-foot engine of destruction. It lunged, its claws swiping through the steam with a low, whistling sound. I didn't dodge. I didn't run. I reached behind my back and pulled the lithium-sulfur battery core from my own suit, the very thing keeping me alive. I held it out like a peace offering. The battery was red-hot, pulsing with the last of its unstable energy, glowing with a fierce, amber light in the fog. To the glass coat, it was the brightest sun in the universe. The creature paused. The mercury eyes narrowed, reflecting the glow. It sensed the concentrated power, the pure, distilled heat it had been tracking across the frozen wasteland of the north. It reached out a clawed hand, its needles rattling in a low, almost purring frequency. It wanted the heat. It needed it to fuel the very vibrations that allowed it to exist. I struck the magnesium flare and jammed it directly into the battery's venting port, triggering a terminal thermal runaway. The battery began to hiss, a violent jet of white-hot gas shooting out of the seal. Eat the sun, I hissed, the cold already beginning to numb my chest as my suit's power vanished. I threw the overloaded core at the creature's chest and dived into the warm, sulphurous mud. The explosion wasn't loud. It was a bright, searing flash of white and violet light as the lithium ignited and the magnesium reached 4,000 degrees. The glass coat didn't scream. It simply shattered. The thermal shock of the magnesium fire hitting its sub-zero, crystalline body was too much for its molecular structure to handle. The creature disintegrated into 1,000,000 shards of harmless glass that fell into the mud like a rain of diamonds, extinguished by the heat of the rift. I lay there in the muck, gasping for air as the suit's life support finally flatlined. I was dying, the cold of the upper atmosphere reaching for my heart. But the air I was inhaling was wet. It was heavy. It was warm. For the first time in years, the air didn't hurt. Hands grabbed my shoulders, hauling me out of the mud. Sarah and Elena were there, their faces wet with steam and tears. They dragged me toward the snowcat, but I pushed them away, pointing toward the bottom of the caldera, where the steam was thickest. Below us, in the belly of the rift, the steam parted for a single, glorious moment. It wasn't a forest. It wasn't a city. But there, huddled around the bubbling geothermal vents, were rows of greenhouses, not made of glass, but of hammered metal, salvaged plastic, and reinforced concrete. We could see the faint, flickering orange of campfires. We could see figures moving between the structures, their silhouettes dark and sturdy against the rising mist. There were hundreds of them, a civilization hidden in the steam. And then I saw the color that changed everything. At the edge of the nearest vent, protected by a leaning wall of scrap metal, was a single stubborn patch of dark, wet earth. And poking through that earth, fueled by the deep, volcanic heat of the planet, was a tiny, translucent shoot of pale green moss. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "We're here," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "We actually made it." We didn't wait for the other glass coats to regroup in the cold. We drove the snowcat down the slope, the lead plates falling off as we went, shedding our armor like a skin we no longer needed. As we reached the perimeter of the settlement, the people emerged from the steam. They weren't scavengers, and they weren't ghosts. They were farmers, their hands stained the very dirt I had dreamed of for 3 long, frozen years. They looked at our lead-clad vehicle and our battered suits with a mixture of awe and recognition. We opened the rear of the snowcat and pulled out the Arkansas. I stood there, my suit dead and useless, my body shaken with the transition, as we cracked the seal on the first canister. The air inside the Ark was sweet, smelling of the old world. I reached inside and pulled out a handful of heirloom wheat seeds. Tiny, gold-flecked promises of a world that refused to stay buried. I knelt in the mud, pressed them into the warm, sulfurous earth, and covered them with a thick layer of lancing silt. I felt the warmth of the ground against my palms, a heat that didn't come from a machine or a battery. It was the planet's own heart, still beating beneath the ice. The silent winter was still screaming outside the caldera. The world was still white, and the cold was still a predator waiting for the fire to go out. But here, in the steam and the dark, the green world had finally stopped running. We had brought the seeds home. I looked at Sarah, who was holding a handful of soil, like it was the first thing she had ever truly owned. She looked back at me, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the settlement's fires. "We're not lookouts anymore," I said, the warmth of the rift finally seeping into my marrow, driving out the last of the Charlevoix frost. Where the harvest, the world would stay cold for 1,000 years. But here, in the wound that bled heat, we would grow. We would wait, and one day, the green would find its way back to the sun.